Yes, tourism. We usually talk about the bright sides of tourism, and since you're working in that industry, you know a lot of the bright side. But as we all know, every industry has its dark sides as well. And we decided that we're going to change the program a little bit because of something that happened in the tourism industry as well, or which was at least affected by it, that we think belongs to the dark side and belongs to the panels as well, that we talk about these things as well. As we all were, as I was, I'm pretty sure you were shocked as well by what happened in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday, where on multiple places and multiple spots, and amongst them a lot of tourist spots, there have been bombs, there have been terrorist attacks, and there have been, I think, more than 250 dead, and amongst them a lot of tourists as well, 65 tourists so far that we know of. What can we do in that regard? What can the industry do? And how do we take these events and possibly learn from them and maybe speak about them? Might help already. We decided to put together kind of a very short-term panel on that topic, and I'm very glad that we have someone to moderate it who's very well informed and who's a very experienced moderator and also in those topics as well. Please welcome with me Aradhna. She's Aradhna Kovala. She's from the steering committee of the forum as well, and I'll hand the panel to you. Please, Aradhna.
In the worst violent attacks in Sri Lanka, since the end of the civil war, nearly a decade ago, 250 people have lost their lives and more than 500 have been injured as multiple coordinated bombs went off all across Colombo. The targets? Innocent families, including children, congregated in a church and praying, or unsuspecting tourists having their breakfast at the Kingsbury Hotel, the Cinnamon Grand Hotel, or the Shangri-La Hotel in Colombo. A fourth bomb meant for the Taj Hotel in Colombo thankfully did not go off. With this random act of madness, the terrorists have managed to strike the heart of the vibrant tourism sector in Sri Lanka. Tourism contributes $4.5 billion to Sri Lanka. That's 5% of its annual GDP. And it also is responsible for 800,000 jobs, which is 10% of total employment. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not the first time, and it will not be the last time. Terrorists resurface, they regroup, and they always find ways to strike in the most unexpected manner, in the most unexpected places. If there is one thing we know, it is the fact that this can happen absolutely anywhere. Sri Lanka needs our solidarity at this very difficult hour. But Sri Lanka also needs to learn from those who have been there before. Please join me in welcoming my panel, three wonderful ladies, three global leaders, and I'm personally grateful to each one of them for really stepping up on this challenge pretty much last minute and supporting WTFL in our endeavor to support Sri Lanka. Starting with Gloria Guevara, CEO of World Travel Tourism Council. We have Her Excellency Rania Al-Mashad, Minister of Tourism for Egypt. And finally, we have Isabel Hill, who's Director of the National Travel and Tourism Office, United States. She's not here in her capacity as a US government representative, but we're very grateful to have you, Isabel, given your expertise with national security. If we look at the past atrocities, be it the Westgate tragedy in Kenya, France, Tunisia, Egypt, there is a big difference between the impact and the time to rebound. Gloria, if I can start with you, WTTC has done extensive research on crisis preparedness. What do the findings tell you?
Well, thank you. First of all, our sympathy and our support for Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, crises are not going away. And as it was mentioned before, it's not a matter of if, it's just actually where and when is the next one. So for WTTC, this is one of our top 3 priorities. We need to work on the preparedness, and during the crisis, the management, of course, to minimize the impact, and after the crisis, the recovery is crucial. We have seen with our research that when the private sector and the public sector work together, we can reduce the impact. We have done a lot of research, and based on the research, I can tell you that when the crisis is managed well, they recover really fast, because the good news is that the sector is very resilient. And at the same time, a tourism attack, for instance, that was well managed, we were able to recover like in 8 weeks. And after 8 weeks, that's the minimum, back on track. And depending on how that crisis was managed, it could be up to 2 years, perhaps. Now, also natural disasters, a big impact. We need to learn from other experiences. We need to try to not to reinvent the wheel every single time. There are a lot of great experiences out there. And the last thing is that we compare the impact between a natural disaster, a terrorism attack, for instance, an outbreak, or political instability. And what I can tell you is that we have a chart that shows that comparison between the minimum and the average. The highest impact that we have seen in destinations, unfortunately, is something that it could be controlled, which is the political instability.
Can we have the chart put up?
I don't know if we have the chart.
I'm not sure.
Just to show a little bit about, our research, but that's okay. We cannot show the chart. It's right there. As you can see right there, we monitored crises all over the world. And on the left chart, as you can see there, those are months or pretty much weeks. As you can see there, tourism, for instance, that you might think is the worst crisis, actually not. When you manage well the crisis, people understand that that was totally out of control, and our sector is very resilient, so people come back. So from, for instance, 8 weeks, you can tell all the way to 10 months. But the highest impact, as you will see there, based on the analysis that we do, is political turmoil. And at the same time, when you manage the crisis in conjunction, the private sector and the public sector, and is proactive and very well, the communication, the recovery is pretty fast.
It's a great segue into you, Isabel, because you have expertise in establishing destination resilience. What's your viewpoint? And I'd love to bring in Minister Rania, your experience in Egypt right after, if you don't mind. How long did it take, and what were the visual signs that told you that you're well past the trauma? Isabel, you first.
Thank you. The first thing I'd like to say is, we are all Sri Lanka. We all share the hopes and dreams of the people there. We all share the aspirations of their tourism sector. And the extraordinary resilience that they have shown already, coming out of so many crises, is extraordinary, and I think will give them great strength coming back. And that's an important factor. One of the things I would like to say is that we also share with Sri Lanka our vulnerabilities, because we are all vulnerable. And I want to speak specifically on this particular question of the terrorist attack, because it was a planned attack. This was not a random incident. This was a planned attack. And I think that it is very important that the tourism industry begin to recognize that we are a soft target in a war that is much broader than ourselves, that we are an instrument being used in that larger conflict.
Right.
And I'm afraid that sometimes we think of these as sort of one-off incidents rather than a systemic challenge. And I would invite the industry to begin having a larger conversation about the roles that the public and private sector can take in terms of mitigation, in terms of the things that we really need to do in order to begin the mitigation of these things. I know we can't stop them, but there are things that can be done and will be done. They have been done in India after attacks there. They've been done in the United States after attacks there. And why do we wait? Why can't we learn and begin to move that forward so that we are actually part of the solution and not part of the challenge?
Thank you. Minister Rania, if I can bring you in at this point.
Well, first we send our condolences and sympathies to the authorities and to the people in Sri Lanka. And I think how Gloria and the institution shows that there is a rebound, there is hope, despite the crisis, because the idea of any terrorist attack is to make the will weaker and just people feeling more and more helpless. In our case, the private-public partnership was extremely important. Investment in infrastructure on security was extremely important, and I think just last month from the WTTC, Egypt was recognized as a champion in resilience for tourism because of the spending on infrastructure and security. When you say how do you know you're out of that, it's when visitors vote with their feet. So you see more traffic, you see more deals, you see more investments coming into the sector. But again, as we saw from the speaker right before, complacency is something that is the biggest enemy. So even though you're doing well, you should not be sleeping at the driving wheel. Of course, we're all vulnerable. It can happen at any point and any soft target. But again, the vigilance, the messaging, the continuing cooperation, also globally, with security forces. I think all countries, when they come together, behind doors, of course, there is a very serious discussion on how to ensure that travel is safer, what are the controls that you need to do in the airports, hotel screening systems. So there's a lot that, and of course now that we're discussing about disruption and innovation, there are modern ways and more faster ways of detecting things and being quite fast in taking action.
I'll come back to the public-private partnership in a minute, but Gloria, I would like to ask you, when there is a traumatic incident like this, often there is a mad rush to get into blanket bans. Travel advisory is just one thing, but Sri Lanka, the next day, US, UK, France, Germany, Australia, all of them issued travel advisory or travel bans against travel to Sri Lanka. Now, all of these countries are in the top 10 source markets for Sri Lanka, so it's a double whammy. What do you do?
Well, the countries have a responsibility for their own citizens, and I think part of that responsibility is to inform what's going on and the potential risk. One thing that we do with WTTC, work very closely with governments to try to make sure that they understand also what's going on and they really communicate the most effective way. I think here goes to the point about managing the crisis. If the crisis is managed well, if the information is proactive and the communication is out there, you see some of these travel alerts with the right context and the right information. We cannot expect from countries not to have these travel alerts because they have an obligation, but at the same time, it's very important to have that communication going in both ways.
I just want to ask at this point in time, do we have anyone from Sri Lanka in the audience? Can we take any questions from the audience? Do we have any questions? I guess not. Do we have a question? Yes, please.
Wait. The queue is coming. There you go.
All right. New Zealand, where of course we had the tragedy in Christchurch recently, and it threw up the whole question about live recording on Facebook and streaming of actions of terrorists like this on Facebook. And I wonder how, we've got plenty of innovators here in technology and everything. How on earth can we allow this to happen? How can we allow all the freedom that Facebook gives to continue in the face of the violence that it's basically putting out there for everybody?
Minister Rania.
Well, I think to think that we can stop something like this immediately, I think we will be faulting ourselves. But I think the Prime Minister did something fantastic. She refused to mention the name of the attacker.
That's right.
And I think that when they are looking to glorify their action on social media by depriving them from that perceived honor, I think that's... but I mean, in terms of trying to stop the live streaming and so forth, how successful regulation can be, I'm not so sure.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? We have run out of time. Last question, sir, please.
It's again on the role of the media. When I started to go into tourism, I worked for the German GIZ, Government Development Organization, in '98. We had the Hurricane Mitch in Central America. And we were interviewed, and the media was so much sensationalist. They asked me, no longer dead bodies flooding in the rivers, and I said, oh no, it's 98% of that region can be still visited, but they don't believe it. What can we do to have an influence on the media, not to keep on this negative image, even if it's not correct anymore?
Isabel, would you like to take that?
Well, I think we all can share some responses with that, but I think that to Gloria's point, you can't start that process when the crisis begins. That is a process that has to begin well before. And we had a very famous general who later became president of the United States, named General Eisenhower, who said, plans are useless, but planning is everything. And you never know how that particular crisis is going to play out. But well before the crisis begins, everybody in the community needs to understand who to pick up the phone and call. They need to have developed relationships with their media. I think we as a community can do a much better job of educating the media about the role that they play in this space. And let's face it, they are a hungry beast. And I think we can begin to serve up stories, because at the end of the day, whether it's in Facebook or whether it's on traditional media, there is an appetite, and I think we can work if we are diligent and if we have a plan and if we know how to connect, and we've got an army of people out there, either a tech army and or a media communicators, who can put out the stories that we want to put out. We are not going to be able to stop them from putting on the stories, but we can give alternative stories. And I think it's part of the narrative that we all need to begin to develop about the heroism that we see in these extraordinary, I mean, every day I would wake up and see what was happening in Puerto Rico, the citizens that would come out. I mean, with all due respect, forget the, governments, forget, they're in chaos. This is people to people, and these stories are compelling. But we don't have a way to get those stories out because the crisis hits and we don't know who to call and we don't know how to get the story out. Again, plans are useless, but the planning is everything, and I really, really think we need to incorporate that into the whole concept of the planning process.
Thank you very much. Before we leave, the clock is ticking. I would love to ask you, just by way of some advice for Sri Lanka, what's one thing you would tell them to do and one thing they absolutely mustn't do?
I would say
very
that,
quickly, 30 seconds.
Just stay very strong and do not give up on the planning. And do not give up on reaching out to the international community and discussing the vulnerabilities and how to actually bridge those and become stronger in the face of anything that can happen going forward.
Brilliant. Gloria?
I think they have to make sure that they keep engaged with the private sector and communicate, making sure that we know that what they are doing, that they are back in business, that everything, people can come back, but exactly what they are doing and what protocols they have followed.
And something they mustn't do absolutely, or?
They must communicate, I would say, and work hand in hand with the private sector to make sure that we restore the tourists.
Okay. Isabel?
They must not give in.
I think that's a great one. That's a great one to also close this session. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. They mustn't give in, and we must not give in to the hate, not in New Zealand, not in Egypt, not Tunisia, not in Sri Lanka. This is a world tourism family, and if Sri Lanka is watching, please know that all of us are with you in this together. If there is life, there is travel.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.